Hi, I'm Tristan, and this is Thinking About Politics. So today, I thought it might be fun to talk about times when I got things wrong. It seems like we live in times where people don't admit when they're wrong and have a hard time changing deeply held opinions. And that's a shame, because it's something I've done several times in my life, and it's always worked out for my benefit. You get some new information, maybe a new analysis, all of a sudden you're reevaluating something you formerly believed. It's great. Now, the uncharitable out there are going to want to call this flip-flopping, and by all means, please have your say. But I gotta side with the great New Englander and American philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson. His take is, speak what you think today in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. And in the past, I've used some pretty hard words to describe Second Amendment rights that would have been right at home in a Marjorie Taylor Greene campaign ad. See, recently Greene was on a podcast with a guy by the name of Sebastian Gorka. Gorka is a former Trump official who may have had knowledge of the January 6th attack on the Capitol before it happened. He has been subpoenaed by the January 6th committee and has gone to court trying to fight this subpoena. Oh, and this potentially treasonous former government official has also been banned from YouTube for spreading false and misleading disinformation. Seems like the type of place Marjorie Taylor Greene would do well. And what's catching people's attention is Marjorie Taylor Greene's horrific legal analysis of the Second Amendment. Ultimately, the truth is, it's our Second Amendment rights, our right to bear arms that protects Americans and gives us the ability to defend ourselves from a tyrannical government. And I hate to use this language. Sure you do. But Democrats, they're doing exactly what our founding fathers talked about when they gave us the precious rights that we have. You know, leaving aside the fact that you're threatening to kill your coworkers for wanting to advance public health and public education, it seems like an overreaction. But her assertion for the reason of the Second Amendment, that it is so individual Americans can defend themselves from a tyrannical government, is flat wrong. But the truth of the matter is, once upon a time, I would have agreed with her. Once upon a time, I believed in limited gun control or no gun control. And I believe that the people of North America ought to be armed to the teeth so they can go to open war with their government at the drop of a hat. I was a lot younger. But I'd open my mouth and things would fly out like, a well-armed populace is the only check on a tyrannical government. And people would talk about banning assault weapons, and I would say, but assault weapons are exactly why we have the Second Amendment. How are you going to go to war with the government if you don't have assault weapons? And I think back, and I try to unpack, why did I think this? There's certainly a cultural aspect. My grandfather was a staunch Republican. He always had guns hanging in his study. I lived in a rural area. Lots of people hunted. But that only gets you part of the way. That's just being comfortable maybe around the idea that people own guns and use them. What got me that extra step to think that the people of the United States might need to go to war with their own government? Well, you know what sticks out in my mind? So in the early 90s, there was a thing, where politicians like Ross Perot or groups like the NRA would take out half-hour infomercials and run their political sort of information as a television show.
Balancing the budget and reforming government.
Good evening.
And I didn't have cable at my house, but when I went to my dad's house on the weekends, I would go and he'd have cable, and I would plunk myself in front of it and just watch cable all weekend. It was great. So I watched the Ross Perot infomercials in 1992 and 1996. I loved Ross Perot when I was 8. At some point, the NRA began running this infomercial, and in this political infomercial, they talked about Australia and how Australia had a gun buyback program, or that somehow guns were going to be illegal in Australia, and that this was a crisis, that it's going to happen in the United States next, and that Democrats are going to take guns, and that's a bad thing. And I thought, Democrats are dumb. They shouldn't try to take guns. And in that NRA ad, they talked explicitly about the Second Amendment, and they tied it to tyranny. And they talked about disarming people being the first step of tyrannical governments taking control of the people. And I was an impressionable kid, and I said, yeah. And as I went through school and we learned about, American civics and history, I still had history teachers pitching the idea that, the Second Amendment was this sort of check on government. I had friends' dads who like hid rifles up in like the rafters of their basements just because you never know, right? Like maybe my attitude towards guns was a little bit of cultural default, right? And maybe it was a little bit of that active brainwashing from this NRA propaganda that I was exposed to. I mean, for all I know, me and Ms. Green maybe watched the same stuff. The difference is I kept trying to learn about this stuff and challenge myself, and I don't think she has. So before we even read the text of the Second Amendment, let's talk about the Constitution. The Constitution is our frame of government. The Second Amendment is an amendment to that. So we had a frame of government, and immediately we changed it 10 times. Those 10 changes are the Bill of Rights. And at the time of their ratification, the protections of the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. They did not apply to the states. So the federal government couldn't establish a religion, but at the same time, you could only be governor in Massachusetts if you were a Christian. The federal government couldn't establish a religion, states could. It wasn't until the 14th Amendment proclaimed that people may not be deprived the right of life, liberty, or property without due process of law that these rights began to be applied against the states through a process called incorporation. So all of these individual rights had to be incorporated into the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment. And it took individual court cases to do these things. Well, would you believe me if I told you it took about 150 years for the Supreme Court to find that the individual right to bear arms was protected in the 14th Amendment? Crazy. Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So I, like a lot of other people, read that to say a well-armed populace is the greatest defense to a free state, and the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's really not what it says. But I, like Congressman Green, was wrong. I think a little history shed some light on this. You see, the founders of the Republic, after defeating the British, faced 2 armed rebellions by citizens. One before the Constitution was ratified in Shays' Rebellion, and the other, the Whiskey Rebellion, after Washington became president. In both cases, heavily armed rural farmers posed a serious threat to the government that the founders themselves had to put down. They didn't find these people to be patriots. They thought these folks were like criminals and bandits. The Second Amendment was not meant to protect these folks from committing what the founders thought were crimes. It protected the right to bear arms so that the governor could call up a militia. So that the governor could call up regular citizens in a pinch and have them hunt down and march against people rebelling against the state. It was not for people rebelling against the state. It was for states to protect themselves. You catch me? I would also later learn that one of the biggest fears the founders had was a standing army. A large standing army they felt under federal control would be a threat to the liberty of the states. So to protect the liberty of the states, states were allowed to have militias. They're now called state national guards. We still have them. Even if us as individuals didn't have the right to buy assault weapons, states would still be able to have them. You catch me? The right to bear arms is actually protected in this way. So there's the first strike. It's like the more historically honest and intellectually correct position is that the founders did not really want to protect the individual right to purchase arms as such. They wanted to protect the ability of states to call up militias, which at that time relied on individually armed people. Our militias now don't rely on that. So, Second is this. Funnily enough, Iraq made me rethink my idea that, the founders really wanted a heavily armed populace ready to just do war in the streets. And that's because the people I knew who served in Iraq, they didn't have a great time. And I'm serious. People in America who have never seen a society devolve into sectarian warfare don't understand how deep down the rabbit hole goes. I mean, I don't understand how deep down it goes. I just know it goes way further down than a lot of us understand. Veterans coming back really convinced me that civil warfare was not what you wanted to see under any circumstances. So why would the founders, who were so smart at creating a government, put in this suicide pill where you could create at the drop of a hat the most bloody and uncomfortable warfare there is? No. We should not be so cavalier as to think war or violence would solve our political issues like that. I was just young and immature. Marjorie, what's your excuse? And let's play this game out. let's logically play this out. Let's say the right to protect an AR-15 is in the Constitution. Well, how much good is an AR-15 going to do against this? Or this? Or a bunch of these? See, the idea that individually armed Americans could do battle with the U.S. military is fallacious in the extreme. And if the Second Amendment really was about protecting the rights of the people to do war with their government, then it would, in theory, protect my right to own an aircraft carrier, or a missile, or a fighter jet if I had the cash. And I'm pretty sure I can't. What's more, wouldn't the Second Amendment mean then that if the government has nukes, I should be able to build my own nukes? So there's like a illogical outcome if this is the meaning of the Second Amendment. It is wholly illogical. And then there was Sandy Hook. The very type of weapon I had been defending people's rights to own was used to murder, like, kindergartners. And, you know, you see these, like, shootings over and over and over again, and always the picture's the same. Somebody in a real crisis gets their hand on a gun because they're so ubiquitous in our culture. See, the problem isn't people having a bad day and going and doing things they regret. That happens all over the world. The problem is we have so many guns so freely available to people that when you're having a bad day, it just becomes easier. I don't know. So all these things were percolating, and Sandy Hook was the final straw. You know, how could I go and defend people's rights to own these things? What were they owning them for? Was it to fight a war? Well, no. Was it really to defend freedom? Not at all. It's a status symbol. We're conflating people's status symbol with a constitutional right. Look, I don't think you have an individual, like, constitutional right to go out and buy a firearm. I also don't think you have an individual constitutional right to, like, go and buy a car or go and buy a pack of cigarettes. At the same time, your ability to do so is going to go unchallenged for the foreseeable future. Nobody, but nobody, wants to take away your right to buy cars just because they're not protected in the Constitution. Only very few people want to take away your right to buy cigarettes. And, you know, a clean majority don't mind the concept of guns. What I have a problem is this. The idea that our founding fathers put a suicide pill in the Constitution and they want us to shoot each other. It's ridiculous. It's the dumbest thing you can possibly say in this day and age with all of the violence and mass shootings that we have seen. Margie, I got sympathy for you if you arrived at this conclusion being inured in the culture you were in. But it is time to wake up, girl. So that's just my quick hot take on the Second Amendment and how I got it wrong. Let me know in the comments below if you like this topic. That's gonna be it for me. You know, you've been great. Hope to see you again next time. But until then, keep thinking.
The arrogance of public officials should be controlled. These are not new words. Cicero said these words over 2,000 years ago, but certainly they apply to our country today.